Well, Peter, right before you press go on your machine, we were talking about families and how a lot of academics get into what they do because of their families. And that's true for me. My dad's a historian, and like a lot of people in many times and places, I'm doing my father's craft. I'm the oldest child in my families, and that's what I do. My dad hired me my first summer in college to do some research on a project. It was a background for a museum exhibit. And I got completely into this thing. And it was about a memoir of a young man who'd gone adventuring in what was then the wilds of Arkansas, the far west of the American and also the German imagination in the 1840s. And I got really interested in what there is to know about places that were once seen as being exotic and interesting and wild, and now are seen as being the completely boring middle of the country that anyone of any means or ambition just flies over between the interesting coasts. And that interest stayed with me in college, and I wrote a senior honors thesis asking about what happens, what's going on when people are writing in letters in their families about their sickness and their health and the birth of their children and the process of getting old. And I called that health talk. And so what was going on in this health talk of people who were moving into lands new to them, Americans, as we would now often put it, call it, people who saw themselves as settling the West. So I wrote an honors thesis about that, and graduated from college in the midst of the last big recession before our Great Recession most recently. We did a whole lot of work, a lot of different odd jobs, did a whole lot of different stuff, and after a while realized that I really missed all that writing and the talking about ideas and the reading and the working through ideas in a really complicated way. And I thought, wow, I don't just miss that because going to school is the only vocation I've ever had so far. I really miss that. So I made an application and applied to grad school and ended up writing a PhD in the history of science and medicine that had to do with kind of the same stuff, right? Asking about people moving west, Americans who saw themselves as settling and settling down land that they saw as real wild. And I said, how come they talked about land as being healthy or not healthy, as being sickly and insalubrious, or being healthy and vital? And they talked about land in the same way as they talked about their own health. And I said, how come? Why is that? And I wrote a book to figure that out. It was called The Health of the Country. And then while I was doing that, I got real interested in stories from the early 19th century about big earthquakes in the middle of the Mississippi Valley. And I thought, what earthquakes? How could that be? I'm pretty well informed about this stuff, and I didn't know anything about earthquakes. So I wrote a book to figure that out. And that's this one that I just got out, called The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes. So I got into this following my father's craft and asking questions. I do have one story about about literally starting, right? I have, I think somebody else might have a better one, but I think I have possibly the best way to start graduate school that I've ever heard about. I was living at this time in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'd gotten accepted at Harvard University, and I wanted to see my family. And like most people starting any kind of graduate program in the humanities, I had, maybe 11 cents to my name. So I scraped up some stuff and bought a Greyhound bus ticket, and I took the Greyhound bus from San Francisco to Boston, Massachusetts, stopping for a week to see my families in Little Rock, Arkansas, and then proceeding on. And I arrived at the Boston Greyhound station on a really yucky fall day. It was really rainy, and so I left a lot of my baggage there, put on my backpack, and went over and got myself checked into a dorm and kind of figured out where my classes were and all that stuff. And then the next day was all nice and sunny and the way fall in New England is supposed to be. And there were leaves turning and it was crisp and beautiful. So I went back to the Greyhound bus station and took out the big oblong, big brown rectangular cardboard box that had my bike in it in a couple of different parts. And I got the big box with the bike in it at the Greyhound bus station and put it on the ground, and I pulled the wrench out of my pocket, and I was, messing around. And I'm not mechanically inclined. I think all I had to do was, maybe put on the pedals and the handlebar, right? But, I was doing that. And the guy it was kind of a slow day at the Greyhound station. So the baggage claim guy was like, oh, what you doing? And I said, well, I gotta put my bike together. I'm starting grad school. He said, oh, really? What you doing? I said, well, I'm starting a PhD program. He said, oh, that's that's great, hey, you need a hand? I said, no, I think I got it. And they said, hey, Vern. He called another guy, hey, this girl, she's starting grad school. Oh, you're going to do that? That's great. I kept putting together, they were mightily impressed with my mechanical skill. By the time I finished, there were 4 guys from Greyhound kind of leaning over the counter, giving me encouragement. And at the end, they all came and took the box, and they came over and patted me on the back, and they walked me outside to the whole station is now different, but at that point there was a whole driveway where you'd go out onto the Boston traffic. And I got on my bike and put my helmet on. They said, oh, gotta wear your helmet, gotta take care of your brain. And I put on my backpack again, and I started pedaling off to start grad school, and the entire Greyhound bus station baggage department waving me goodbye and saying, good luck, study well, have a good time. And it was the most wonderful benediction I think anyone could ever have for starting a PhD.
Yeah, everybody should have rituals like that.
Yes, yes.
So, I'm always intensely interested in the roots and the first experience, that first research experience.
Yeah.
What was in it for you that made you keep going?
What was in research that made me keep going? Probably the same thing that would make you want to ask questions of people, right? And probably the same thing, if anybody watches a show like this, the same thing that would make them want to hear more from people. I would read letters, and remember, this is, I was reading stuff in the early 1800s, so back before people could pick up a phone, right? And when people needed to write their thoughts down, and you'd read these whole stories, right? Stories of sometimes very sad stories where people would be telling the story of a loved one's last hours, or stories of a great deal of hope. There were these really funny, sly ways in which young women would write to their far-off families and include little notes, and it took me a long time. I was pretty young when I started working on this. Didn't have any kids then. It took me a long time to get all the different ways in which young women would communicate to their families that there was a baby on the way, right? So all these small little things, women writing to their mothers, my James, her husband, he's a hard worker, your doubts were ill-founded. And you think, whoa, there was a story there, right? People writing about their hopes, what they wanted to accomplish. People would be describing places they were going, and I knew from other historical records that often these places were real hard ground to grow stuff on, right? Or the land was expensive, or I knew that they didn't have a lot of money, and boy, that must have been a real hard life. But they would write in these glowing terms about their new life and what was in it for them. And you could just see both the real stories of what people were actually doing, what they were growing, what their hopes were, but also the stories they were creating, the narratives they were trying to tell other people about what they would do. And somehow being able to have that little bit of window into other people's lives, I've just found incredibly compelling, right? And especially when there are ways in which their lives are very like mine, and I would find myself very much identifying with things in my sources, but then in other ways they were utterly different, right? They were operating in a world of great violence, where the everyday life of chattel slavery was right up there with everybody, man, woman, child, black and white, slave and free. They were living in a world where people dropped dead, often, of infections that we now cure with a little ointment, anytime we get a cut, or with, where epidemics could sweep through and kill all your children really fast, right? And although we still live in a world where those things are possible, and some people's lives are touched by them, most of us in modern North America are very distant from that. And so it was interesting for me to see all the ways in which these people of a past world, many of them living in places not very geographically far from where I grew up, but very far in time from my life, how they lived their lives. Oh, I'll tell you one thing that was really cool, too, that I saw that kind of maybe expresses some of that immediacy if other folks haven't had a chance to look at these family letters the way I have. So they're written on old pieces of paper that make noises. The paper was real good quality back in the early 19th century, and it kind of creaked and crumbled. And people would write with quill pens, often very, very fine hand. And paper was expensive. So people would write one way on a piece of paper, and then often If you had more to say, you would turn the page 90 degrees and then write the other way. So there'd be this crisscross of text, right? And I'd be in the archive with my head down reading, and if somebody would say, hey, Conevery, I'd look up, and I'd think, I've lost it, you know? There'd be no way to find it again. On one of these letters, it was a family correspondence about the Santa Fe Trail, a bunch of traders doing work on the Santa Fe Trail. I kind of opened this one set of letters of a man to his fiancée, and there was kind of a splotch up at the top. I thought, oh, huh. Reading it on through, And at the end, he said, my darling, I miss you. I miss you so much. I miss you so, and I see these mules, and one of them's nuzzling the other, right? And he talked about the mules kissing, and he said, my darling, I miss you. I will send you my kisses. And then there's kind of a space, and then he says, okay, now I've inked my lips, and you will see my kiss at the top of the page. And I turned the letter back over and looked, and thought, oh, that splotch was a man's mouth, and he was mustached, right? He had a lot of facial hair, like a lot of men of the 19th century, and those were his whiskers, kissing his fiancée.
Don't get better than that. Now, you mentioned kind of in passing that this land, which was once exciting, the West, the frontier, the dangerous place, became flyover land. And I think about, why did it become flyover land, or why did it become like that so fast? And the answer seems to be, in part, the Mexican War. I mean, if you add a new frontier within, 15 years of the opening of the old frontier, then suddenly all of the places that seemed exotic and dangerous to you seem like stepping stones to someplace else. And you mentioned that as kind of editorial commentary on the places you were, but I'm wondering, do you run into that shift in the historical record too, that suddenly people say, we're not living any place very exciting anymore, or
yes.
do the conceptions still remain? How did that go?
Yeah, people are very, very clear about talking about, well, that was the old frontier, right? What was interesting, and maybe from a modern perspective, what continually surprises me is the way in which Mississippi is the frontier, right? Alabama is the frontier. Arkansas, right, is the frontier of a lot of people's imaginations, right? Then it's Texas. I mean, so that a lot of people might think of the West as starting somewhere where there's tumbleweeds and arid landscapes, and thinking about American cultural imaginations, many people were moving north to begin with, and moving east, and moving south. But even those moving west began very, very far east. So the continual finding of new lands isn't just a kind of cornball aspect of the way in which we used to tell bad old histories. That's something that's very live for people of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the sense that that not just the country, but that individual peoples and households' well-being depended upon new land. I mean, there was a lot of agricultural reason for that, right? A lot of crops, especially cotton. Cotton's a really hungry crop, right? As farmers would know far better than I do. And after you crop cotton a couple of years, you can't. That soil ceases to yield, right? So people, and this is in an age before the artificial creation of fertilizers, and also before people had when in terms of their costs, it was far more worth it, especially to slaveholders, to go to new land, right, and use up those nutrients in the land, as opposed to having a smaller plot of land that you manure and really fertilize really, really well. So intensive agriculture is one solution, and in places where land prices were high, people did that. But for most of the sharecrop, most of the people, landowners looking for land, it was better to just, have a field gang, cut down more trees, right, and claim new land and keep going. So this quest for new land isn't just a kind of idealism or a kind of cultural construct. It's what you need to do to grow crops, right? And the families that I read stories from and about, who were mostly the free white people, although I could also get some access to some of the African American people living in slavery, whose families were also part of this movement by force. they were engaged with talking about newness and new lands in a way that was, metaphorical about this is untamed and this is land we don't know and it's land we're going to shape. But also what they meant was it hasn't grown cotton, it hasn't had a corn crop, it hasn't been planted in wheat before, therefore the yields will be high.
And that's a conception, presumably, that farmers in North Dakota, let's say, would never have.
Tell me more.
What I mean is, my people, homesteading North Dakota, I presume their thought was, we settle, we establish the place we dreamed of establishing in Ireland, and then we keep buying a little more land till we really have the place we...
Right.
And then at the apex, and there's actually a house in North Dakota that reflects this, we build something like the squire's house.
Right.
We don't quite, we have to bring in the marble a lot farther, but we build, the squire's house, and then we can really replicate the old country, but we're not moving.
Right. Well, certainly there were those in many geographic regions. I mean, I'm telling you one story and saying it represents everybody, so
yeah.
Yes, there are going to be exceptions, even in the more southern and western territories I'm describing. You're also describing a set of immigrations that take place a couple generations after what I'm looking at, right, and post-Civil War mostly, and that is an era in which there is less sense that there's a kind of infinite, or not infinite, but a very large newness to still conquer, right? So I think it takes place later and with more sense of constraint.
Must be kind of an interesting fantasy to think about what would have happened if the frontier had been shorter. If the history, if we hadn't added what the Mexican War added, if the Louisiana Purchase had been less land, and so people came up against real barriers like earlier.
Well, and certainly people, Americans claiming that land came up with tremendous barriers, both environmental but also those of other people, right? I mean, this was not empty land as much as Americans tried to say that it was, right? It was land dealt with by people whose peoples had claimed that land for a long time. So in many parts of North America, those who wanted to call the land new, who wanted to say it was wild and wanted to settle it down, were dealing with people whose ancestors had been farming that land and working it and hunting from it and making lives and civilizations around it for many generations, right, back through time. So when I'm describing people who are insisting that land is new, that's an insistence, right? That's not just a flat description. Right?
Well, did you run into in the letters you were playing with, places where how people wanted things to be rammed up against how they were?
Yes, very much so. And actually, one of in my first book, The Health of the Country, one of the reasons that I was so very interested in looking at how people describe the health of the country, and part of the reason that I use this, kind of old-fashioned notion of settling new land and going on the frontier, right, is that I wanted to understand how when we look at the very language of conquering land, right, in the places where people, mostly white people, are most ambitious about what they're going to do and how they're going to take and make this land and seize it and own it, that's also where all of their vulnerabilities show up, where they're making it most clear that they are deathly worried that their children will die, right? And as I argue in that book, that there's a whole lot of reason why people of the early 19th century thought that moving from one place to another place actually literally transformed your health, that your body was acclimated or seasoned to a particular place. You were of that place. So when you uprooted yourself and your family and you moved, you needed to remake that connection with place, and you were going to get very sick doing that. So many people might be familiar with the question with this notion of seasoning, right? That you have to have a seasoning illness. And a lot of people moving, especially in the Mississippi Valley, would get a series of illnesses, often involving very, very high fever and chills, and we would most likely identify a lot of those fevers as malaria, although they were probably mixed in with a whole lot of other diseases as well. And people were very aware, even as they wrote these very bold notes back home to their relatives in Vermont or in Massachusetts or in the Carolinas, that they would write these very bold statements about how they were there to take and to make a place for themselves. They also were aware that the process of doing that was going to make them weak, might make them sick, might sicken themselves or their loved ones, the slaves whose labor they relied upon, right? So it's in the language of conquering that we see the most vulnerability, right?
And, I mean, weren't they just simply right about all that?
Well, in those fears about seasoning, there were also a lot of racial ideas that I think we would say very emphatically were completely and malignantly wrong. That certain people, by dint of their racial composition, belonged in certain places. And this is part of the very nefarious argument for why African-descended people somehow belonged working in the hot sun, right? Because the peoples of Africa were from that kind of environment and therefore could take the heat and could take work, were insensible to pain. I mean, there's a whole evil litany of racism that was bound up in these medical ideas that, no, we don't agree with at all today. So what's interesting is we would say, well, yeah, people were getting diseases in a new place. They weren't getting them because that place had miasmas, which is what they thought, miasmas being a kind of essence of a place and the essence of the diseases of a place, right? We would say, well, they were getting sick because a mosquito carrying a malaria plasmodium bit them, right? We would agree with some of their experiential descriptions, but not with the overall framework that somehow, if you're a Mainer, it will make you sick intrinsically to go to Missouri.
I think I'm 64, and I think about the reason I don't travel to South America. It's that I think I know, that my body is used to Minnesota's microbes and would undergo some kind of adjustment to South America's microbes, and I'm at the wrong age to undergo very many of those adjustments.
Well, what you're saying is exactly what a whole lot of people said about moving to new places. They would say, nope, too old, my body can't take that seasoning, right? And today we'd say, go to the travel clinic, right? Get your shots, get your immunizations, right? And make sure you strain your water so that you're not introducing into a gut that's naive of those sort of things, new microbes that you can't deal with, and you'll be fine. But I think that there is a way in which reading in an era in which I got here to this beautiful campus by getting on an airplane and traveling enormous amounts of time, enormous amounts of space in a very compressed time, and I get off the plane like it is no big deal to fly through the air in a metal box, right? I mean, that is astounding. That is miraculous, and we act as if it's a part of the everyday, because it is part of our everyday. And this 19th century anxiety about travel and anxiety about the physical costs of displacement and of going to new places is, I think, in some ways a kind of reminder to us that, as you say, with your worries about going to South America, it is a big deal. That's true. So I think that piece, yes, is kind of prompts philosophical reflection from me, certainly.
And I suppose if the State Department announced that, there's no potable water in Ecuador, that would take Ecuador off my list. Even though I could do what everybody in the 19th century also could do, search for streams that were relatively safe, and I mean, Pasteur's a little later, so you don't know about boiling yet.
Right, that's right.
So it becomes very close to the same situation when you lose a reliable water supply. This is all fascinating. It leads to, it sort of begins to answer the question I want to ask almost existentially, because I took some of the routes you took, and then I took a very serious divergence from you, which is I didn't become a scholar in this sense. And that means you and I both really like hearing stories.
Yes.
and getting inside people's lives. And I like getting inside a lot of different people's lives about an inch and a half. And you go on to write books, which means you say, which is still, I mean, they're broad books. It's not like you're focusing on, you know, one person or one family or 1 year. But still, you focus, you decide to dedicate a bunch of your time to a particular question. And I'm always interested in how you make that choice. And to what extent is that a choice? And I've had people say, it isn't a choice at all, it's your advisor. You know,
oh, that sounds terribly depressing.
You have the wrong advisor. You know, you have a particular advisor, you work on, you know, you work on gerbils, and there's no way you're going to get out of working on gerbils if you have, you know, if you happen on in this department, this guy. And but I'm curious about your decisions to commit to long projects, to book projects. How did those get made? What was it that moved from this is kind of interesting to this is something I'll give a couple of years to?
Well, a professor I had an undergraduate who I respected very much, who when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, I met with him and said, you know, I think this is what I want to do. I'd like your perspective. And he said you should go to graduate school in the humanities when you want to write a book. And you should do that because then you'll know when you're done because you'll have written your book. And going back to school as a grown-up often involves a lot of sort of yucky infantilization, and it can be really weird to be back being a student, back, you know, when other friends of yours are starting businesses and paying mortgages and participating as adults in the modern world, right? And you can feel like you're not. So he said, you know, so your goal is to write a book. And when you're done with your book, that means that you've gotten out of graduate school everything you can do. And I thought, yep, I am going to go to graduate school to write a book. And I'm never going to let myself forget that before I started my PhD, I made a living doing a whole bunch of other things, a lot of different odd jobs in San Francisco for a couple of years. And that at any time I could make a living again doing something else. That I'm going to choose this, but I'm never going to tell myself, I'm never going to let myself forget that if this academic thing doesn't work out, I can make a living doing something else. And I think that then gave me the freedom to absolutely fall in love with what I do. And say, wow, this stuff is so exciting, I want to do more of it and I want to solve these problems. And I think each of the 2 books I've written came out of a question. Right, a series of questions. Why? What does it mean? When I was reading all these letters that people would talk about the healthy country or the unhealthy or insalubrious, you know, this is an insalubrious valley, a healthy mountaintop. And I thought, gee, what do they mean? And I went and looked in a lot of books and read a lot of really smart historians' work, and I couldn't find that answer to that. Nobody seemed to have noticed that. So I thought, wow, I'd really like to know that. And the incredible, magical gift of working in universities or our whole university system is that because I was privileged to be in that environment, I could find a question like that and chase it down and pursue it. Go, wow, I can solve this problem. And when I felt like I got it solved, I had, right? In the second book, it was really about how come there are earthquakes, apparently, I guess, kind of know, was there something like an earthquake that I'd never known about? How come our histories, and as far as I knew at that time, our sciences didn't tell us about earthquakes in the middle Mississippi Valley. I'd gone to the West Coast and learned about earthquake country. I'd go back home to Arkansas and people would say, oh, what is it like living where there are earthquakes? I didn't understand that I could turn around and say to them, well, you are living in earthquake country, you tell me, right? So in each case, it was answering that question. Although I have a story about how I started the second book. So I knew I wanted to do something about earthquakes, and I knew I wanted to do something about the early 19th century, and I'd long ago read a story in a book about earthquakes that made me curious, but I kind of didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I'm married to someone who, among many, many other virtues, is a fabulous consultant, right? And so I said, Matthew, here's what I want to do. I want to write a book that is about the early 19th century. I am really interested in the hot and humid territory just west of the Mississippi, and he groaned and rolled his eyes because he would really like it if I would become very, very interested in things like the history of Caribbean beaches or something more pleasant. But I said, no, I'm really interested in this, and there's this swampland, this great swamp, literally called the Great Swamp, right, in northeast Arkansas, southeast Missouri, that I think is really interesting. And again, there's more eye rolling, right, but he's a patient man, he got it, it's okay. And I said, but my last book was about these powerful but amorphous cultural ideas. I want to do a book that has specific events that happen at specific times. So, project manager, what am I going to do? He said, all right, let's look for this. Let's think about this. That next day, a colleague comes to dinner who's passing through town who does Arkansas history. And we got to talking about the new Madrid Earthquakes. And literally as we're doing dinner, my husband turns to me and says, so, has anyone followed up on that? Has anyone done a history of these new Madrid quakes? And boom, I had my next book project. I thought, all right, now I can go back and find and chase down those long ago questions that I had. So we decided at that time it was going to be a real short book, maybe coffee table, really nicely illustrated, real quick to do, kind of on the impact of the earthquakes in the early 19th century. And then I started working on this project and thought, and discovered, much to my chagrin, that I couldn't write that as a quick and short and simple book, but there was a really complicated story about the ways in which these earthquakes had indeed happened and had a lot of effects. But then we'd gone through this 100 years and more where they'd been forgotten, and that only really recently have changes in the sciences meant that these earthquakes are getting a kind of legitimacy as an object of study, right? So it wasn't a short book by any means, nor was it the popularly oriented book that I had originally wanted to write, and I hope someday to write. It was a long and pretty wonky book, tracing the various ways in which, the very complicated ways in which an event that is these earthquakes that were understood to have taken place at one time, that were seen as important and significant for science and people's spirituality, for their sense of their physical selves, for American settlement, for native communities who were trying to fight the Americans. All these ways they mattered in the 19th century. They became rendered into tall tale and fiction, the butt of jokes, by the late 19th century up through the 20th century. And then they're getting rediscovered. And that story ended up not being a short book, but ended up being the story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. You know, there's a place for the Lisbon earthquake in Western history of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
The 1755 quake.
Yeah, it was big enough to shake people's faith.
Yes. Yes.
And to become an example that people who were thinking about God had to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
So some things get held. Some disasters are interesting because some disasters get held for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and keep getting reread or reinterpreted, or
Mm-hmm.
they get a public, and
Yes.
others get lost.
Right.
And there's this matter of of lost history. So I want to ask the very biggest question: why do some things get lost and
Right.
other things not get lost?
Well, and you know, that's important, but there's also this way in which there are disasters that we remember, but in very different ways, right? So I was first starting working on this book at house schools of little kids, and we were at one of these, local fairs for children, right? And I was watching my kids go up one inflatable slide, right, where you pay your ticket, and little kids climb up the side of this inflatable thing, and they slide down, and woo, and it's great fun, right? And the slide is the Titanic, right? And one of those little children I had held in my arms weeping, watching news coverage of the fall of the towers after 9/11, right? He was born just a little bit before then. And I thought, well, what would people think of in 100 years if there were some inflatable slide, made of those Twin Towers, right? And I mean, that's just not thinkable, right? It's a horrible criminal thought in our current society, but so would have been making a toy out of the tragedy of the Titanic 100 years ago, right? Excuse me, not quite 100, but Yeah, 100 years ago. So there's both the forgetting that an event occurred, but there's also the rendering it into something that can be laughed at, or something playful, something that is a children's game, like, oh yeah, right, we know the Titanic, yeah, Mommy, can I have another ticket? Right? Yeah. And some of it has to do with, and that some of the things that get forgotten and denied have to do with who they affect. So part of the reason that my book, the second book, ended up being so much longer, both in scope and in duration of time it took me to write it, than I had planned, is that the sources for this, it turned out that part of the story of the New Madrid quakes was, well, you know, if an earthquake hits in a swamp and nobody's there to hear it, does it really make a difference? And part of what I found was, no, there were lots of people there. They were Native American people. There were communities of people who had left what is now the American Southeast because they were sick and tired of Americans taking their land and their culture, and they had moved into the Mississippi Valley in order to get away. And those were people who we did have records of, but they were records that were buried, that we had to find, right? That I had got fabulous assistance from the Missouri Department of Local Resources to find probate files, lists of what people have when they're dead, that showed a thriving Indian trade out of this little bitty river town of New Madrid in the Missouri Boot-heel. So some of that had to do with the fact that the people who felt that quake and were most affected by it, whose communities were disrupted, who moved because of the quake, were not the people whose records would be kept by Americans, whose word would be believed, whose languages would be even understood necessarily.
So you have this interesting responsibility and privilege of holding on to something that was in some way, multiple ways, destined to be lost.
Yes, I mean, I also argue that there are environmental changes to that region in lumbering and the cutting down of trees that were part of the earthquake evidence, right? So an earthquake in a floodplain doesn't leave like a jagged tear on a rock. It messes up some soil that then quickly erodes. So some of the record of the quakes are in living organisms, especially trees. And many of those trees were felled, right, to be turned into board feet to build thriving 19th century American cities. So some of the changes that made these earthquakes, the New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, that made them become invisible to our contemporary society, were changes to environment. Some of it were the changes brought about by warfare. So those who know Civil War history will know this quake epicenter region as the site of the Battle of Island No. 10, which was a crucial battle in federal control, battle for federal control of this vital artery of the Mississippi River in the Civil War. And that battle was made possible because Confederates had an island that was well defended because it had a natural moat of swamps. What we don't see in the histories of the Civil War is that those swamps were created by the earthquake. That's seismic terrain, seismic features of the land that made the Battle of Island No. 10 possible. So there are reasons that are environmental, there are reasons that are social, that have to do with our military histories and how we tell the histories of regions where there have been big battles. They also have to do with scientific changes, right? So the development of instrumentalized seismology, starting in the 1880s. So there's this incredible revolution within the earth sciences between about the 1880s and the 1920s where seismology gets instrumentalized, right? Where instruments will tell us about the movement of the earth. Forget old newspaper stories where people told long, flowery narratives about how they felt and what they thought about their eternal soul and how they smelled the sulfur of the devil and saw flashing lights and were so scared for their little ones. Forget all that. That's not scientific evidence. What's evidence is the paper records that we can see, we can reproduce, we can quantify. And look at all the exciting science we can do once we have that instrumental record, right? So there's an irony that the changes in the introduction of self-registering scientific instruments, and in particular seismographs, those help us see certain kinds of seismic activity very, very clearly and well, and gave us a whole science that is, still exploding with insight. But they also made us not see, not pay attention to events that had only been recorded in narrative and in newspaper story before.
Oh, this is a story I've heard so often. That is, in the wake of new technical things, and I'm thinking about MRI, thinking about the ability to sequence DNA, but there are hundreds. In the wake of it, there are also always incredible numbers of orphans. Very promising projects, very promising lines of research, very promising facts that simply nobody's interested in anymore. And it's a very common and terribly important phenomenon, as far as I can tell, in the history of science.
So that when we, for instance, in this astoundingly short period of time in the late 60s and early 70s, when this kind of seemingly fuzzy-wuzzy crackpot idea of moving continents, right, continental drift, this idea that continents are somehow drifting on the surface of the earth, right, which is against all reasonable sense experience, right? Like, yeah, sure, the continents kind of fit together like they're in a jigsaw, but, that's no way to make scientific reasoning, right? Once, in the aftermath of World War II, we got really interesting imaging of the seafloor that tells us how new crust is being created, right? Wow! The earth sciences were just revolutionized once again with the notion of plate tectonics. That yes, we are standing on pieces of tectonic plate that are moving. And we usually can't feel them moving, except when they bump into others or slide up against others, or one piece of that crust subducts under the other, and then we know that is an earthquake. And that scientific model explains very, very well and clearly, and in a way that most of us non-scientists can really grasp, why it is that we have earthquakes in most of the world's major earthquake zones, especially what we call the Ring of Fire, all up along the North and South American west coast, up over into Alaska and then down in Japan. So that explains so much, so brilliantly, and in such an exciting way, that earthquakes that happen in the middle of continental plates became the much less interesting question, right? Became the kind of like dubious, do we even really know this is happening? Kind of, this doesn't fit our model, and it's not where the grant funding is, and it's not where a lot of the interest and the exciting interpretations are, right? So it took a couple of intellectual generations for the few people interested in what's called stable continental region or seismicity to say, well, actually, plate tectonics, which does all kinds of wonderful things to explain, can't yet predict, but explain earthquake motion in much of the world, doesn't actually explain all the world's earthquakes. That there are earthquakes taking place in northwest China and in the Australian outback and in the Mississippi Valley that are not well explained under the plate tectonic model, and we need to be asking questions about why those take place so we can understand them better.
It's a matter of predictable blind spots, which is maybe the most interesting thing in the world. Where will the blind spots always be? You can almost see it. But I'm wondering if you ran into another thing. I mean, one thing that, coming from Minnesota, which is different, but it's in the middle-ish, sort of. We have a sense, I think, a rather boring sense, oft expressed, best expressed by Garrison Keillor, but oft
See, I knew I could not get through an hour-long interview in Minnesota without Garrison Keillor.
Yeah, I mean, that we're the solid center of this continent.
Right.
And that crazy stuff happens on the West Coast, where people don't have to wear so many clothes, and they do stuff. And dangerous political stuff happens on the East Coast, where all the lobbyists are chasing all the politicians and trying to get them to do stuff that will do in the rest of us. Now that's, we got these big forces on the coasts, and we've got this solid center that's preserving the sanity and the integrity of the country. That in Minnesota, well, we fought in the Civil War, but we didn't get involved in a bunch of that stuff. We were above it, literally. And I mean, I wonder if those myths come in here too.
I don't know. Tell that to the Minnesota boys dead at Shiloh.
Yeah. But I mean, do you think this myth of the solid center means you don't want earthquakes in the solid center?
I think that it's very common for us to reason from history based on the last generation or so of what we know, right? There haven't been earthquakes where I am. That doesn't mean, you know, geology's very long, right? And there are patterns that are much, much longer than human experience. I have a neighbor, I live in Boston, and I have had a neighbor who's since passed away, very, very old man who lived next door to us, who found out I taught environmental history, and said, you're a tree hugger, right? And he would bellow every big snowstorm as I'd be out there with my kids shoveling him out. He would come open his door and bellow at us. So you see any damn climate change happening now? This doesn't seem like global warming, does it? And he was so deaf and so crabby that I do not think that I was very articulate in talking with him about the fact that global climate change does in fact involve erratic weather systems and can in fact involve unseasonable cold, like the winter that Boston has just suffered through this year, the February that we've just suffered through. But from his experience of 90-odd years of New England, there was no evidence, right, that he was willing to see of anything like change. Now, he also had a whole lot of stories about ice on rivers that my children hadn't seen, right? So I actually think that if he'd looked at his own life history more carefully, he might have actually seen that evidence. But he was determined not to see that. But I think the thing that I would have wanted to say to him, if there weren't howling snowstorm winds and if he weren't so deaf and so mad at me all the time, the thing that I would have wanted to say to him was that even 90-something years of history and of our own story is very short compared to the Earth's record, right? And that our sense, whether we are from, you know, the solid South or the stolid Minnesotan upper Midwest, our sense of that story of the world is very recent, and that the world's histories are much, much longer.
Reason to teach history. Well, I'm curious about, you know, the Hegelian arc of your development. I mean, to work first on broad ideas.
Mm-hmm.
As you tell your story, you decide, so I want something concrete, none of these broad ideas for this book. And so you get a particular event.
Yes.
A story of a particular event, and the story of the forgetting of a particular event, or the
yes.
redescribing of a particular event. Where does that leave you with regard to your ambitions and appetites at this point? You've done the big idea history, you've tried to do the narrow event history, which
right.
I'm sure turned into a big idea history
yeah.
in some ways also. Where does that leave you as an historian?
Oh, there are questions everywhere.
Yeah, but what sort of thing now seems like the right thing to give another couple years of life to? What sort of thing?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so one of the things that was both very interesting and very uncomfortable for me about working on this project, The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes, was that I was trained as, and was real happy being, a historian of the 19th century, right? Where everybody's dead, right? And nobody can argue with me because they're all dead. And I realized in the course of working on this project that I actually had to go forward in time and deal with very recent issues, and in fact with some ongoing science. And that meant that I had to deal with people who were very much alive and who might get indignant with me or want me to write something in a different way. And that's really uncomfortable, but very, very interesting. Right? And one of the things that has just been so fascinating about working on this project is getting to talk to earth scientists about their work, and hear the passion and the fire of colleagues of mine who work in the sciences for trying to communicate the immediacy and the meaning and the consequences and just the excitement of what they do. It's tremendously fun, right? So one of the arguments that I make to my students at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, right, is that history matters. And that knowing where we come from does help shape our present day. And I would like to be able to be the kind of historian who could write a book or a set of writings that would speak to present day concerns and that would speak in a way that, you know, ordinary interested people, not just other wonky academics like me, might be interested to read. So I'm working that out now. But I think there's a whole lot about the history, the way in which the history of the earth sciences affects our current resource use in the United States. I'm particularly interested in hydraulic fracking, right, and how the science of so-called induced seismicity, like what are the ways in which human beings can interact with the earth and produce earthquakes, usually very, very, very small ones. You know, what does that have to say for this new technology of fracking? Because as a number of papers have very recently demonstrated, there's some pretty good evidence that injecting a lot of material in our injection wells, which are often used to get rid of the wastewater produced in fracking, is tied to earthquakes. So I'm really interested to investigate how is it that we know that, right? And what kind of evidence do we use? In what ways does that science make a difference or not in how we choose to site fracking rigs or injection wells? And how does the uncertainty about that relationship between, you know, is any one particular seismic tremor related to any one particular injection well, right? How do we want to deal with that scientific and kind of that uncertainty of knowledge when it really matters quite a lot, or it could matter quite a lot in our present day? So that's kind of one of the things I'm interested in looking at. But I got there are all kinds of interesting stories about the world, and I have a bunch of books I want to be writing. So.
Well, I mean, I've heard, you know, the beginning of a history about the University of Pennsylvania and fracking and the research that was done there, how it was supported, and what else was going on there at the same time. You can't, I expect, study that without getting into the history of corporate involvement in research and corporate pressure on research.
That may be true.
And I'm wondering, and I mean, Kennedy wrote this book, partly got him elected, Profiles in Courage.
Now, we just opened the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Study of the American Senate next door to the UMass Boston campus, so I would say you're talking about John F. Kennedy.
John, yeah.
Not Edward.
That John.
Not Edward.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, I mean, this notion, one thing that I'd be curious about is there, in the areas that you've explored, is there a Profiles in Courage to be written? I mean, I'm thinking, series of, you know, what he did was a series of people who at crucial points in his estimation, or Schlesinger's estimation, put their lives on the line to make a point that needed to be made.
One of the very interesting things, interesting stories that I was able to tell in this book, The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes, is that of the Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, who articulated together very, very powerfully a whole vision of indigenous resistance to American cultural takeover. And their stories get kind of flattened and stereotyped and kind of told in this very simplistic way. And seeing some of their story through this earthquake history, because they used naturalistic prophecy and prophecy about the earthquake to bolster their cause and as a, you know, as part of the spiritual impelling for their movement of cultural and military resistance in the War of what we now call the War of 1812. Being able to tell that story was very exciting and very rewarding. I think, though, as a historian, one of the things that really, really interests me, as I was talking about earlier, are the ways in which ordinary people's stories are fascinating, right? Looking at the particular details of individuals who are themselves not particularly noteworthy. I mean, now he's quite famous, but a long time ago I read the story, the memoir written by Solomon Northup, right? The person who wrote 12 Years a Slave. And now there's a really interesting major motion picture, right, that dramatizes that. So his story is quite rightly much better known. When I was first reading that book and writing about it, you know, only a few historians were really aware of what an exciting text that was. And I think that's a really good example of somebody who was extraordinary, not because he was a person of privilege or because he was in a position of power, but because his observations about the life that was ordinary at that time for many people in slavery and kidnapped into bondage are so compelling and so well observed and so thoughtful. I mean, in that book, Solomon Northup not only tells us about what it means to be a slave, but describes the way in which you create a trap to catch you know, small animals, right, to make more nutrition and make more money for yourself as a slave. He describes how he kept a herd of pigs, right, to make side money for himself while living in bondage. I mean, all these details of ordinary life to which we have very little access otherwise. And I think those are the kinds of stories that, that inspire me and that I hope would inspire readers of what I write.
We have just a couple minutes, and I wanted to go back to this matter of relevance, this matter of speaking to 21st century concerns and problems and so forth. I mean, there could be a lot of visions of what a teacher is supposed to do at a place like, you know, like the place you teach, and what a teacher is supposed to do in books that are read beyond their professional colleagues. How do you understand what you're primarily trying to do as an actor on the, you know, on the public stage, as a teacher now?
I walk into my classrooms telling students that I hope that they will leave our interactions with the ability to read well and write critically and vote in an informed way. I have the privilege of teaching courses on the United States Civil War and Reconstruction to classrooms of people, usually roughly half of whom are going through UMass Boston on the post-9/11 GI Bill, having just served often several terms of duty. So I'm describing and leading us through readings and discussions of a war that tore apart our country to people who've been part of an American military endeavor that is ongoing. And it is humbling for me to hear their insights about, for instance, what it means to undergo training. So, for instance, anybody who knows about the Civil War will know that both the Union and the Confederate side were dramatically underprepared for the first powerful military engagement at Bull Run, and that the Battle at Manassas was a fiasco, really, for both sides, although the Confederates won it, partly because learning to march is extraordinarily hard, right? The Union troops took far longer than they should have to get to where they were supposed to do, because it's hard to march in a large group, and that takes a lot of doing. And when I say that, and I describe how hard it is to march, and you get all bunched up and that, half of the class goes, oh, yeah, thinking about it. And the other half of the class goes, yeah, Right? And being able to see with new eyes past historical documents, and being able to hear, often slowly and often only as the semester goes on, my students coming to think through their own experience, not just as their idiosyncratic experience, but as a whole part of a history, right? That their terror and their joy and the things that scared them or were easy or hard for them, that's part of a continuum, of a historical continuum of people who've been to war, of people who've helped make war, and of how the United States has waged war. That to me speaks to some of the most important things that I can do as a teacher.